Assalamualaikum everyone, and today we are bringing to you somebody who is very important to our community and basically family law in New Jersey as a whole. Asma Warsi Esquire. So as you know, I've been talking about this, my dear audience, for a little bit. We're going to have her live today to talk about what she does in the field of family law, specifically New Jersey. And I'm joined by my amazing host, Daanish Sayed.
And I'm also very excited, to speak with Asma today.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. Before we dive into today's topic, I'd love for the audience to get to know you a little bit. So tell us a little bit about yourself. What inspired you to go into law?
It was my grandfather. Growing up, my maternal grandfather lived with us for several years, but while I was in high school or a little bit earlier, and he was a outsized fan of Muhammad Jinnah and always talked about how great lawyers were and how much control they had and what abilities they had to convince other people. And he admired that tremendously. And I think that's what inspired me to pursue the law because my mother was very unhappy, as most mothers of that generation. She cried when I told her that I wasn't going to go to medical school. But I think in hindsight, it was a good choice because my math skills are good.
I totally understand where you're coming from when you say that my mother cried when I told her that I didn't want to go to medical school. I mean, I think many of us that grew up at that time, in the United States, it was an expectation of Pakistani American kids that were growing up here. You either go to medicine or engineering, and law was this kind of like outfield kind of.
I think, and as I'm sure for other people who emigrated around the same time as my parents, the process of immigration is very disorienting. You're in a new country where maybe you speak the language, maybe you don't, and then you definitely don't know the culture and don't have the same family support system. You don't have, an understanding of how things function. So I think immigration in general makes people more risk averse. And so for my mother, being a doctor was the way to make sure that people are financially stable. She didn't know what lawyers did. And truthfully, neither did I. It was basically just what I saw on television. So when I think, families of that age families came at that time, they wanted their children to be successful, to get an education and to follow a career path that felt more certain. Law at that time wasn't considered that. And I'm really happy that this younger generation of young people are pursuing the law and pursuing lots of different iterations of careers that you can go into with the law degree.
It's funny, you mentioned about immigration, and there was a brief time early in your career you went into immigration. Do you think your Pakistani American identity had anything to do with that, or your?
Well, my practice at Rajan Legal is sort of a hybrid of both immigration and family law. So I do both there. The issue with immigration is these days there are so many barriers and complications that most practitioners haven't seen before. So in that sense, I think people need more help than they used to. As far as my background being Pakistani, absolutely. I was very aware of the fact that I was an immigrant. I mean, I was, second generation. I think is the right way to describe it. As a second generation immigrant, there were still things that I didn't learn at home. Like, I like to tell people I learned to speak English by watching the Brady Bunch reruns. I was not watching when they were on for the first time. So that's how I became Americanized. And so there was a process of assimilating to American culture, American people that in my generation, I think, television because our parents didn't know it and couldn't teach us.
Indeed. So when you've told your mother that you're going to go into law, and then you're approaching the field, and not many
obviously not only just Pakistani individual or immigrants, but not many brown folk are to be found in the field of law at the time when you're going into college and then law school. Tell us about that journey briefly. Like, what was that like? And just, you know,
There were maybe a handful of people. So when I decided to go to law school, there was a very dear family friend who showed me a copy of her, um, personal essay. And I modeled much of what I wrote on her because I didn't know anyone else who was applying. I think there were maybe 2 to 3 people that I personally knew. And then I think in terms of Muslim, Muslim, Pakistani, Indian, South Asian, any of those, there were, enough people you can count them on one hand. But now you go to a South Asian Bar Association event, that are New Jersey Muslim Lawyers event, or even, the State Bar Conference. There is a very growing number of South Asian attorneys, brown attorneys, Muslim attorneys. And it's really wonderful to see because I'm so glad that, our communities are moving in that direction to make sure that, we're not all just doctors or, computer engineers or, I guess it wasn't the main two that I can think of off the top of my head, where, young Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan children tend to count a.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting you mentioned earlier about your connection between immigration and family law, because, with us at Women to Women, with our Shizori House project, there's a connection between the two. And we want to, get your insight that how was that transition, how do you find that connection between the two different, even if they sound different, how are they, connected?
So, the process of immigration in the United States, in different countries have different systems, but in the United States, immigration is based on 3 legal grounds, right? The first being humanitarian, so asylum, being a victim of a crime. So those are things that can allow you to become, a lawful immigrant in the United States. The second is through work, but the most important and the most I think the largest percentage of people who come to the United States do so based on family connections, and a lot of them come based on their marriage. A lot of the immigration cases I was dealing with, they were getting divorced while also trying to figure out what their immigration options were. In some cases, the immigration was more important, and so if you can navigate between the two people, for some people, it's not such an issue. They have an independent basis and they don't need to worry about what their spouse will do to their immigration status. In other situations, they're willing to make compromises with family law, the size of maybe the settlement, and use that as leverage to get help with the immigration process. So, that's why I enjoy doing both, because there is much more of an interplay between those two areas than, casual observer would be able to tell. Also, the population that we have here, I'm based in Middlesex County. Rajan Legal's offices we have one in South Brunswick, Kendall Park, the other one in Island. Those are very heavily South Asian areas. So our community really relies on our firm, and so much of the population that we assist and the clients we serve are South Asian.
so it's no secret what's happening in terms of immigration law and the ability to not only immigrate in this country, but to also to be naturalized eventually. How is, without delving too much into politics, how is that affecting the overall spectrum of immigration law specifically? We'll definitely go into family law after this, but just for curiosity's sake, I would love to know, how do you see less hopeful cases? And I know there's different spectrums that are definitely being affected, right? Things that are happening in the country right now. So what do you see in terms of that?
So I've been a practicing immigration attorney, or practicing attorney, for almost 25 years. Over 25 years. And the difference that I'm seeing is there is so much instability in the system. And so what is hard from the point of view of an attorney is when a client comes to me, they're coming for my opinion and my legal advice, right? And so in terms of how the system used to function, I can tell them that. But with this administration, what we're seeing is rapid, immediate change, which is not something that most lawyers like. It's harder to predict how certain things will end up. So, it used to be that if you did this, then this would be the result. And you obviously couldn't guarantee anything. And any attorney who guarantees you anything that's not in their control is being disingenuous. But the issue really is when they come to me and they say to me, like, okay, what do you think might happen? And I give up my most educated guess. I always have to, footnote that and say, listen, I'm telling you based on how the system used to function, it could change. Some clients understand that. Other clients think that because you're the attorney, you're in control of the process. And unfortunately, that's not the case at all.
Let's switch gears for a little bit and talk about family law. So, like, as a South Asian family law, okay, so just kind of going back to something that I was told as a young person because I think family law is actually very important, especially in South Asian culture, because there's this like almost taboo where it concerns, not almost, definitely taboo, where it concerns divorce cases, child custody. I think there's always this kind of and not for anything necessarily wrong. There's always a kind of encouragement of mediation, not to head towards divorce, etc. As a South Asian, especially as a Pakistani individual, I know with Pakistanis they tend to be a nuance of a little bit more
Our culture is really built on weddings,
yes,
right? So
exactly. So
most families, most communities, not just nuclear families, but also extended families, right?
yeah,
We all get together when someone gets married. Oh my gosh, it's getting engaged next. And so much of our culture, and also from a financial point of view, Pakistani weddings and Indian weddings are not inexpensive. There are multiple events and lots of expenses associated with it, basically the food, the clothing, and the location of these events. So I understand why there is this bias towards marriages. On the other hand, which I think is true of both, Hindu communities, Muslim communities, it's true of both. But in certain situations, it's better that the couple separate. And, again, I'm not an expert in any of the Hindu scripture, but, I have studied Islamic law and, the Quran was very revolutionary at one point for giving women the right to sue for divorce. And the idea of, the med is also intended to allow women to have that financial freedom to leave a marriage that they don't want to stay in. And the other very basic difference between U.S., Christian orthodoxy, essentially, and how the Christian faith views marriage as a covenant between the husband and the wife and God. Islam has a very different view. In Islam, a marriage is a contract. And it's a contract in the same way that everything else is a contract, and you can break the contract if the terms are not to your liking. And I think that is something that is part of our faith, but oftentimes is lost in a lot of the cultural conversations because people's attitude is, oh, you can't take it. But from my experience, what I see is staying in a marriage where the parents are deeply unhappy has such a detrimental effect on the children.
indeed.
And although the process of divorce isn't easy, the process of divorce can be really painful, difficult, and there are a lot of people who feel that they would face the community's censure. I think that's unfortunate. I think that it's always better to have a negotiated, mediated divorce instead of a contentious one where you're litigating and fighting over everything. But that's a separate question about whether or not you should get divorced. And again, unlike, the Catholic Church or any of the Protestant churches, a woman can file for divorce. And in US, sort of just to move away from the more religious pieces of it, according to New Jersey law, because I'm licensed to practice in New Jersey and New York, and I'm certain most other states are like this as well. If you file for divorce, you're going to get divorced. The terms of it, the financial settlement, the division of assets, the division of debt, custody, parenting, alimony, child support, all of those elements can be negotiated and are very unique to each family because families are so different. But if one person files for divorce, then the judge is going to grant the divorce, which is different than Pakistan, where you have to, or even India, I believe, you have to get permission from a judge to actually get the divorce. So there is that very fundamental difference. So when clients come to us at Rajan Legal, that's one of the first things that we review with them is like, listen, if you came from a culture and a society where you think getting the divorce is the battle, just know that in this situation, that's not going to be the battle. The battle is going to be how many nights are the kids with mom? How many nights are they with dad? Who gets the house? Who gets the credit card debt? All of those things are the retirement account. So there's a lot of financial details that need to be worked out. But the simple fact of whether or not a divorce would be granted is usually is up for debate.
Going off of mediation and the role that lawyers play, especially in our community, I heard this a lot. Lawyers always make things as a push without anything, or make things a lot worse. What do you have to say to those people? Because
I don't think all of those people say that until they need a lawyer. One of my most favorite clients, very sweet man, came to me because he and his ex-wife lived in New York. And they went to one of those divorce services where you pay $400 and they'll prepare the divorce for you. I mean, this was about 10 years back, so I'm sure now they maybe charge like $500 or $600 or more. But essentially, it was go there, they prepare some paperwork, and then you're divorced, right? So you think you're getting a bargain. Unfortunately, in his case, post-divorce, there were so many custody issues that I think he ended up spending between, I would say, 20 to 30,000, on fixing something that could have been fixed if he had just spent the money. And those are his words. Like, that's not coming from me. He said, "Oh, if I had known in hindsight, I would have had a lawyer in the beginning to resolve all of these issues instead of dealing with them after." So I think people who think that lawyers don't have anything to offer don't really understand or have lots of misconceptions about what it is that a lawyer brings to the table. First of all, we're a service industry, right? Like, we are a professional service. We are providing service to people, clients, and we want them to be happy. No one is going to be happy if they feel like they spent more money than they should have on their attorney, right? Like, if you walk into a store and they're like, "Oh, these eggs, like, we'll sell them to you for $300. Like, if you really need the eggs, you'll buy them, but you won't walk away happy and you won't go back. You won't tell your friends or refer your friends to that attorney. So in the same way, we're always looking for the most cost-effective solution for our clients. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited to be at Rajan Legal. I mean, are there attorneys who don't have that ethos? Probably. But not being one of those people, I can't speak for those who do.
So going based on what Daanish was saying and what you elaborated, what are other misconceptions, especially coming from a South Asian background? I know already, yes, there's one thing that, as you said, that they believe that lawyers, like, it's all about you extending the case. I've heard people say that, and you did answer much of it, but when you hear certain things like that, like, don't, I heard that they will extend my case just so that as long as you're a client, you'll get paid, et cetera, et cetera. Like, how do you deal with people when they come in with this kind of misconception about
I think the main thing is, from the very beginning, making sure that we're not giving them either false hope or misconceptions. If someone comes to me and you have, a husband and wife who both work, they're W-2 employees, so there's no income that's hidden, they maybe own a home with a mortgage, um, have children that are young enough that they want to be with both parents. In that sense, and very little assets, right? Like, so they have a house, they have, cars that they're paying off, that's it. That kind of a family will not need high impact, aggressive divorce litigation. So in those situations, the best thing for them to do is go to a mediator. And that is also part of the services I offer at Rajan Legal. The advantage there is it allows you to be much more creative with solutions, right? So judges are constrained by the formality and all of the details of the law. They don't have discretion to do something that is outside of what the law allows them. And so, if they're going to, for example, custody, right? Most judges will default to 50-50 unless there's some kind of really compelling reason for that not to happen. The other issue that can be dealt with, that issue can be dealt with better in mediation because it allows the parties to be more creative. Like, okay, you know what? This is how we're going to deal with custody, right? Like, your mother is the one who has been taking care of the kids. So if they stay with you Monday to Friday, then, I can go and work. And it allows the couple to transition from being, a family where the two parents live together to being a family where two parents live separately. But at the end of the day, they're still a family. So it's important, I find from my experience working with clients, the more bitter the divorce, the longer it takes for those feelings to go away. So one of the things that we always counsel clients is, listen, you can go after your soon-to-be ex-spouse in very painful ways. The problem with that is, at the end of the day, that's still the mother of your child. That's still the father of your child, right? And that bond, it's very integral, especially again, because Pakistani families are so community oriented, right? We have households where you have, 3 generations living together. And most Pakistani kids can tell you who their khala is, and who their mama is, and who their chacha and their pupi, because they're all very close to their, not just, again, their immediate family, but also their extended family. And having that rancor, it doesn't go away, by the way. So again, when people come to me and say, oh, you know what, you are only trying to make this worse because you want to run up your bill, the flip side of that is, you can't walk into a car dealership and say, I'd like a car for $100. That's just not a realistic cost. So part of what I struggle with when I have clients who are like, I don't understand what I'm paying you for. You're paying for my experience, you're paying for my expertise, because I can see problems that you might not see because you've only been through this one divorce, right? And again, this isn't a function of education or intelligence. It's none of those things. It's just a question of experience. So having seen multiple cases, having read case law where there are so many other situations, I can anticipate problems that you might not. So there might be language in their divorce agreements that's important because I can see what would be an issue in the future. And, I actually just found out this recently, but most of the cases that are currently in family court and most of the motions that are currently filed in family court are called post-judgment motions, meaning the couple is divorced and they're still fighting. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I struggle with is clients who have unrealistic expectations. Like, I want to go after him for everything that he's got. Okay, we can do that. It's going to cost. because there'll be involved. There's expenses involved. There are legal research that needs to be done. So again, getting back to that, customer service mindset, if you have a client who wants something that they truly don't need and truly can't afford, my role as their attorney is to tell them, like, listen, this is what it's going to cost you. That money would be better spent in other places, on your children, on your family, on rebuilding your life after divorce. But, some people understand that and some people don't. So that's why, although I would love to be able to represent everybody and I would love to have everyone as a client, I might not be the right attorney for every single person.
It definitely has to be a match for sure. You want to feel it. And there's two things I definitely want to make sure we ask going off of, what you were saying earlier is, you were talking about mediation. And, a lot of times lawyers have to play therapists, but obviously lawyers are not therapists. So do you ever, recommend to family law with your clients to, go therapy as a group, or is that within your scope at all? Or
again, getting back to advising clients to use their resources wisely, is you can spend an hour on the phone with me complaining about your ex-husband, your ex-wife, your ex-mother-in-law, your ex-sister-in-law. I have to bill you for my time, right? Because I'm spending time on your case, and you're essentially just venting and sharing, which, obviously we'll need to do in the middle of a divorce. There's a lot of emotions involved. But talking to me for an hour will cost you significantly more than hiring a therapist and talking to them. You can spend an hour venting to me, and there's very little that I would be able to do because I don't have those skill sets about how to handle that, right? But a therapist could give you a better set of tools than I, as an attorney, would be able to. And I'm always eager to, send my clients to therapy, sometimes in, Pakistani communities, in communities, Hindu, Muslim, South Asian in general, there is a bias against therapy because it's as if only crazy people go to therapy.
Uh-huh.
And my philosophy about therapy is more that it's like exercise, right? Or like going to the doctor. If you have a broken leg, wishing that it's going to get better isn't going to make a difference. You should go to the doctor, and the doctor has skills and tools that they give you, medications, a brace, all of those things.
Exactly. So speaking, kind of going based on that, and kind of just reminding us that there is a reluctancy, especially in the South Asian family system, to seek out. When do you, when you are talking to a client, is there some point where you are able to ascertain that this person is ready to take this step towards divorce, or is there ever a time where you recommend them going back and kind of reconsidering it? Because sometimes and let's be honest, there's the flip side of taking the plunge. There's threats too. I think it is a big, as it is as a taboo. So some people might use it, and unfortunately, I talk to my, gonna say it, I'm talking to my Pakistani audience out there. And it's very common in Pakistan specifically to use the word of divorce as a threat.
Yeah.
So is there times when people seek you out and it seems almost they're not fully in, it's more like something they're doing to kind of hold over their spouse? And how do you deal with people? This is very left field, but I
don't know. Honestly, it's not. It comes up very frequently. You'd be surprised, right? So most of the time when people are actually ready to file divorce, it's way past the time that they've been thinking about it, right? It's not like, somebody wakes up on a Saturday and it's like, oh, you know what? I'm going to go, clean the kitchen and, take the car to the mechanic, and then I'll file divorce on my way home. It's never that flippant a decision. It's usually years of trying to make it work and it not working. Or, in certain cases, especially I see amongst the younger generation, they are quicker to realize when they're not a good fit with their partner and walk away before they have kids. But usually situations where people have children, they struggle with it for a really long time. And oftentimes they'll come see me, do a consultation. One of the reasons why our office charges for consultation is because, I want people to feel like they're getting a service, right? If you're paying for my time, you're also getting my legal advice, right? You're not just getting an opportunity to vent. And if someone says to me, like, I'm just here gathering information, like, I love that, right? Because maybe you're not ready. And my job isn't to force people who don't want to be divorced to get divorced.
Mm.
My job is to help people who have probably tried every single thing they could think of, everything that their family, and particularly Pakistani families and Indian families, everything that their family members have told them to do, everything that their imam or their priest or their, for the Christian Indian community, for their church leaders to say to them, like, oh, do this. Their family, their friends, brothers, sisters, they've tried everything. It's still not working.
Mm.
And so then by the time they come to me, they might still not be ready. Like I tell people, my job as an attorney is to provide you with options. Ultimately, you are the one who's in the driver's seat. You are the one who has to make these decisions. And just because I think this is the right decision for you, which I'll sometimes say, like if it's very clear, like, oh, well, this is the best option for you, and this is what I would recommend you do, people don't want to go. And that's okay. Because again, my job is to be an advisor. My job is not to be the decision maker. That never works. I mean, early in my career, I made that mistake with a client and realized you can't force someone to make a decision as their attorney that they then leave your office, walk out the door, and they have to live with. So that is a big part of the conversation that I have with my clients, both at the beginning and in the middle, and then I'm going with this, and can you live with this? And the other unfortunate thing is when you're talking about divorce, you've gone from a family, that's either living on, jointly on one income or two incomes. Now you'll have, two separate households. And so your financial options always decrease because the money that you're working with usually doesn't change, right? Like most people, when they get divorced, they're not making more money or less money. And then you still have to support your family with that same budget. So a lot of it is about choosing the less bad option, right? So there's not a good option, there's a bad option and a worse option. So which is the one that you flip? So.
And talk about another type of topic, which kind of came to my mind earlier, is in our culture we always talk about prenups.
Mhm.
And well, we don't talk enough about it actually.
We actually don't, yeah.
And we see it as a really bad thing. Forgot, you'll still see, we even have it in our culture where if someone suggests it, it actually breaks off engagements in South Asian
And
communities.
actually, you can put conditions in the nikah, I think, which a lot of people don't know about, and that would be
It's essentially a prenup too.
Yeah, and then you.
I mean, the New Jersey law doesn't look at it that way.
Right.
It's a little bit different, especially because typically, the meher is a very nominal amount and usually not enough. And New Jersey Family Court reports of equity, meaning they want to do the right thing. We are not a 50-50 state. And so within the United States, financial assets are divided based on several different models. In New Jersey, we are a equitable distribution, which means that everybody should get their fair share. And that's why going to mediation can be more creative because you can barter certain things, right? Like maybe you really wanted this one thing and your ex-spouse did, so you could negotiate that, say, oh, I'll take this and then I'll give you this other thing that you really want. So having that flexibility I think often is helpful because again, it goes back to when I'm trying to, encourage clients to go to mediation, I'm like, listen, you can either have a judge tell you how your assets will be divided, how your children will spend time with you if they're ex, or you can negotiate this directly. And again, in an ideal world, would everybody have a happy marriage? Yes, that would be wonderful. But that's not the world we live in.
So when you take on cases that there was a prenup in place, do you see any difference between, the like obviously I'm sure people try to fight it, but a lot of times because a lot of people don't also understand with prenups as well as, essentially when a divorce is happening, you're seeing two people at their worst. It's an emotional taxing time. A lot of times don't have control over all of it. And when I do even talk about it like in favor of it, I always tell people it should never be seen as in favor of one person. It should be in favor of both people. And essentially it's to prepare for a very no one wants divorce. No one signs that, the marriage certificate thinking it'll end in divorce. No one unless they have motives, which, not which is a very small percentage. How do you see a difference in those cases when that couple, thinks about these things before marriage essentially?
I think it's smart, uh, some marriages end in divorce. And depending on what you bring to the marriage, there might be inequality there. And if that's something that's important to you to preserve and maintain, particularly, for example, in second marriages, right? In situations, that's usually where within the Pakistani community, prenups are most necessary. You might have children from a prior marriage, and you have assets that you want to leave to those children. Not that you're trying to do something bad to your current spouse, but you want to make sure your children are protected. And so that's often the scenario that's very common for prenups within the Pakistani community. But I agree, not enough people talk about them, not enough people understand them, and I think it isn't very romantic. And usually when people are getting married, they're very hopeful and optimistic about the future. I would love to say that you shouldn't get a prenup, but I think in most cases, if you have assets to protect or you have children to protect, then it's critical.
Just kind of going back to and off of your prenup, like in terms of, I spoke briefly about there's conditions that I know that the marriage contract that's done specifically in Muslim cultures. I'm not aware of what they do Hindu cultures, or I know there's no such thing in Christian cultures or Judean cultures, but as in Islam, marriage is a contract, and there are certain conditions that you can put in previous when you sign these papers. To those papers specifically that they've signed in, in a masjid or in like in a nikah ceremony, do they hold any of for lack of any value in such
In
divorce case?
It's like very fact specific. And actually, interestingly, Jewish law and Islamic law are more aligned than I think people understand.
Okay.
Just given the history of, how Islam developed. And, again, a lot of it depends on, was it freely negotiated? Was there any duress? Meaning, like, were they forced into doing it? Did they have an opportunity to review it? Did they have an opportunity to make changes? How much time did they have to review it, right? Like, okay, read this, sign it now. That's usually a situation where someone can argue, like, listen, didn't know what I was signing. And I felt like if I didn't sign, then, she would marry me, or he would marry me. Those are usually situations in which it wouldn't hold up. But again, if it was fully negotiated and everybody had the option on our attorney, not necessarily need an attorney, but you should be given the opportunity. Once that happens, then I think that it would be much more likely to be treated by a Jersey Superior Court judge as a document that could be enforced.
Okay. And how would you recommend, like, how can couples approach divorce with dignity and minimize like unnecessary conflict? Again, it's a very emotionally turmoil, tumultuous times. How can they minimize that? Is it something? Is there ever a divorce that's amicable? The term amicable divorce almost seems like a oxymoron. Like, is there ever such a thing that can occur where they're approaching it, in a civil fashion? And what can they do to,
I think the thing is, coming into the situation, you have to know that it's going to hurt, right? Um, I've seen very short marriages, and the couple, young, no assets whatsoever, no children together. There's really um, nothing to fight over, but it's the death of a dream. And I think, when people go into a marriage, they have a dream of what the future will look like and who they will be with and what their family will look like and what their day-to-day life will look like. And then, maybe things that they'll do with their grandchildren. I think the biggest issue that I find with divorcing couples is that they have to deal with that component of it. And the clients who seem to bounce back more quickly are the ones who understand how painful this process is. They do what they need to do to take care of themselves, whether that's, um, committing to a healthier lifestyle where they're eating better food and exercising, or, committing to their faith where they rely on their faith to give them more strength and sustenance, or their family, whatever it is that you do that helps you. That's what is the support that you'll need through the process. And the other thing, of course, to remember is, it does end. I think someone going through a divorce feels like this is going to be my life forever and it's always going to be like this. But I've seen how once the papers are finalized, once everything is done, it creates closure so that people can go on and rebuild their lives. Um, but again, it's not easy and it's not painless. Never.
We've been talking a lot about younger generation, old generation, and one thing that we always hear from older generations is आज के बच्चों को शादी निभानी बिल्कुल नहीं आती है. Meaning they don't know how to sustain in a marriage. As a lawyer, what would you like? What is your thoughts on that statement? Because I disagree firmly, and I said another. I'm gonna spare everyone, but I want to hear your.
No, I'd actually be curious to hear why you would disagree, considering your.
The thing is that a lot of the new generation, their mindset is always that we have to make our lives going forward. Now it's a double-edged sword. Some people, I'm gonna say, they may could work, but we're never in that situation. We don't understand it. I also feel that it's also changed for women as well. Back in the day, women were a lot more financially dependent on their spouses, and their decisions were also a lot of financially motivated. The new generation women, their thought process is, we're not financially dependent here. Maybe it's a relapse from kind of like, where you go from one direction of the spectrum to the other direction. They see their mothers be kind of subservient and realize they don't want that life anymore. There's, the human mind is so complex. There's so many different thoughts and ways you can go about it. But generally the idea that I go into it is that like if two people are not happy, obviously we can all have our opinion. We could even find a way to talk about it for 4 or 5 hours. Mm-hmm. But essentially when you're two people in that situation, it's about them making it work. Mm-hmm. It's about them. And who are we to judge their lives?
I agree. One of the reasons why I don't like telling my clients what to do is because, they're adults, right? It's not my job to make those decisions for them. They are, their role is to decide their own, and it should be. On the other hand, as far as why drogues is becoming more common, I think it's also, changes in people's perception. I think it used to be that, if a couple got divorced, the parents of maybe either the husband or the wife, their immediate reaction would be, the rest of our children will be able to get married because, you know, कोई रिश्ता नहीं बेचेगा हमारी बेटी को, हमारे बेटे को, हमारे खानदान में इख्तिलाफ हो चुकी है. So I think that attitude is changing. And I also think, you know, again, this is not, you know, in any way um, an official opinion or based on, this is just based on my observation and my opinion, right? I freely admit that I could be wrong. But I also think that people's expectations of marriages have changed. And it used to be, you know, in my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, it was the girl's job to make sure that there was a family and the family was taken care of. It was the man's job to provide. And that was it, right? Like there was no requirement that your husband or your wife be the person you rely on for emotional support. You know, that's what your sister and your mother were for. And I think that dramatically changes what people are willing to put up with. And I think that's part of the reason why, you know, divorce is becoming more common, because if you're in a marriage where you're not getting the kind of financial support that you want from your partner, you're not getting the kind of emotional support you want from your partner, if you're not financially dependent on that person, it's easier to walk away. Being alone is better than this.
Oh. Well, you know, because we at Chisori House see that a lot, and you know, we see a lot of cases, and you know, contrary to you know what public perception may be, you know, there actually have been a lot of successful reconciliation within our Chisori House project, because even though people know it's for the shelter home, there's a lot of mediation done by our board members, and you know, and they were not pretty. You know, reconciliation's not pretty either. You can't romanticize it. It takes a lot of hard work on both spouses to reach that reconciliation point. But one of the biggest things that I found in our recent cases, especially the case that I took on a few years ago, is that retracting statements, and especially in the terms of when there's physical, you know, there's some sort of a physical or emotional abuse. And I've learned that the law, once someone retracts such statements, that case goes from here to there in terms of difficulty. What would you, you know, and especially in that case, we're in no position to tell them, do not retract it. You know, at the end of the day, we're just there. We're friends. That's like what we like to call ourselves. What would you, in those situations, what would you recommend that, you know, like should be, or what is your thought? Yeah.
So just to make sure that I understand, you're saying that when somebody files for divorce and then retracts it,
Not retract. Well, a lot
when you
of
say
times.
statements,
So, like for example, they'll file a court case, you know, in the divorce. They'll file for divorce essentially, and then they will, you know, claim physical and emotional abuse, and then you know, like, and then they'll go back to the
And then they'll
spouse.
reconcile. Okay.
They'll
So
reconcile
then,
with
and
that.
then they're saying, no, I'm not.
Yes.
Whatever claim I made was not valid.
It's not about invalid. It's about I retract. I don't think they have to like say that it's invalid. I don't remember exactly what was said in this case. Ironically, we get a lot of cases, but I just remember that when this person had to refile later, or multiple situations when they had to refile, it made the case that much harder because their words were just not as valuable as it was the first time around.
Well, I mean, I think anybody who has worked with victims of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, the statistics show that most people who are in those kinds of relationships make 7 attempts to leave before they finally leave. So it's not so unusual to see that, you know, someone is saying like, you know, this happened and I was injured, or I was the victim in this way, and then saying, no, it's fine, right? Because marriage is so central to people's identity, and it's hard to let go of that. And so there might be things that you're willing to put up with because you want to remain in a marriage. And again, you know, it's not my job to tell someone who is making that choice that their choice is wrong, because maybe that is the best choice for them, right? Like it's not really for me to decide. What I do tell my clients consistently is, if you're staying together for the sake of the children, my experience is that it's really hard to be a good parent if you're not happy. And, I mean, again, I'm not talking about, some sort of constant happiness the way you would sort of see in movies or television. I'm talking about just generally, right? Like if you're generally miserable every single day, that will affect your children, your family, your career, your life, the way you are in all interactions versus, someone who is happy and happier with their choices. As far as retracting statements that they've made, does it undermine people's credibility? Sometimes, the New Jersey Superior Court has a view of domestic violence that's called um, coercive control, which is a newer model for how to look at domestic violence and see that sometimes the physical piece is a small portion of it, or the threat of physical violence is there. That doesn't necessarily need to be carried out for someone to feel threatened. And so a lot of family court judges will look at it that way. And again, at the end of the day, this is a very fact specific analysis. Every situation is different because people are different. They experience different things, they have lived different lives. So it's really hard to generalize about all cases saying, all domestic violence cases are fake or all domestic violence cases are real.
Yeah.
It's really just important to look at the individual people.
Absolutely. And consistency of storyline, we have our whole, in our portion of everything as well. But, going back to, I love that point you just brought up about, not being able to be a good spouse, because I always like to think of it as, even in our jobs, how much should we flourish when we had a great manager? And when we had a less than great manager, how much more difficult was a job regardless of how much you mastered it? And that's kind of what I think of, in a marriage, when you have that supportive partner, is just so much more. Your home is a sanctuary. When I come home from a big day of work, and when that home does not feel safe, how can you expect to function normally? It's not going to work.
Yeah, no, one of my former United States Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, I'm a fan of her career. Not all of it. Not all of her career. I mean, there was definitely missteps, but one of the things that she said is, for a woman, the most important decision you can make about your career is who you choose to marry. Because she said, if I wasn't married to my husband, I would not have been a Supreme, U.S. Supreme Court Justice. And I think that, that's the advice that I give, young couples, despite being, a family law attorney or divorce attorney. I don't want to discourage people from getting married. A happy marriage is a wonderful thing. But I think there are things that people can do to make sure that their relationship is good. And one of the books that I always recommend is, or an author I recommend people read, is John Gottman. And he's written several books. Of course, I can't remember a single one of the titles, but his research studies showed with about 97% accuracy which couples were going to stay together and which couples were going to get divorced. And it was all built on communication, respect. And I think, that's true of every relationship, whether it's with your husband, wife, your child, your parent, your boss, your neighbor, coworkers. Like, if you are not putting into the relationship and you're only, taking from it, eventually that equilibrium will occur, right? So again, I think that that's something that people who want to avoid divorce should think about. Like, how do we make sure that we're both communicating and treating each other respectfully?
So that kind of reminds me of this meme that was circulating a few years ago, where this girl writes on her Twitter or something. She's like, "I wish you could choose our baby fathers," and then there's a response which is like, "Is someone going to tell her?" But working with Shizori House Project and everything, I do actually think about how many women, like, sometimes when they're getting married, are people actually thinking this is going to be the parent father of, or, even from a guy's perspective, the mother of, my children,
Mhm.
are they ever thinking that? Or are they thinking, oh, settled this? I've seen the qualifications, but I've never actually heard someone ever say to themselves, like, oh, will this person be a good spouse? And that kind of thinks me, like, even if that meme is ridiculous, are really people thinking that question? It just,
Yeah, no, I don't know.
I think in general, whether it's somebody who ends up, and many of
Yeah.
those women are, frankly, there is arranged marriages in our culture. So let's be honest, like that is a question that doesn't necessarily come up. It's almost like a resume that
Yeah.
that people view, and then the marriages are fixed. Even if you go to like how marriage happened in Western culture, like if you're when you're in the throes of love, as they say, there's a lot of there's a reason why they say looking at somebody from the lens of love, because there's a lot of misfit things that you, or red flags you tend
Right.
to ignore because you're in that emotional state where you just don't see it. And then when you're on the other side, you're like, wait.
Right.
you know and so I don't think, I mean, I'm so but that meme is actually it is silly because you don't necessarily know how somebody's going to behave, in especially as in a paternal or maternal way,
Right.
when you're in that romantic onset of a relationship.
And so, kind of going based on that, like we talked about a lot of new couples. I know, and I observe, especially in not just in American, Pakistani, or American South Asian cultures, but I see even it happening back home. Like there's a lot of what they like to call as gray divorces happening, and I think it comes back to our point that they were saying the women are becoming more financially independent, or vice versa. Men are realizing that they don't have to stay in marriages where they're unhappy per se. How do you, how does Rajan, I'm so sorry, Rajan Legal, and you specifically approach such cases? Like I'm sure that is a nuance on its own. Like it's, I think with newer couples that you can see it a little bit more clear, whereas like
I think, first and foremost, it's always the individual people, right? Because that's who you're dealing with. In cases of quote unquote grave divorces, you then have adult children who are sometimes choosing a side, sometimes not choosing a side. And then that can be an additional complication because you might have, the one partner who's initiating the divorce. And that's not necessarily the person who's happier through the process. I think the person who files the divorce is just more certain that this is the path they want to take. But the pain, I don't think significantly varies between the person who's being divorced and the person who is divorcing. But getting back to you know, gray divorces, I think in certain situations, what people expected from their marriages has changed. And so when they're trying to figure out what works in a gray divorce, in some cases it's more complicated because they usually have more assets to fight over. And in other cases it isn't. I often think that maybe socially there's more pressure because it's like, well, why are you getting divorced now? You spent your entire life together. But again, yeah, it probably means that the marriage was just really kind of limping along for a long time. And then the glue that kept that couple together, which was the children, is gone. And, maybe there's less social pressure from families who, um, you know, parents might not be able to tell their children, their adult children who are parents themselves, like, okay, this is what you should do because now, they're like, fully adulting.
Thank you. Your insight has been very, very knowledgeable to me, and I'm sure our audience out there as well, right, Danish?
Of course.
And so if someone is watching today and facing a family law issues, what advice would you give them if they're trying to approach this subject? Like, what's the best piece of advice that you would give to them out there, Frankie?
I mean, obviously choose the right lawyer, right? You want the right lawyer for your case. I do recommend that people talk to a couple of different attorneys, despite often, if they're financially able to, even if you have to pay for the consultation, because again, when you go to the doctor, you can go to 3 doctors for the same ailment and they'll have different approaches on how to treat you. And there'll be one that speaks to you more so than the other. And that's what I'm recommending people doing. It's like talk to the person who's able to communicate with you in a way that you understand. It's a very personal relationship because especially during divorces, other areas of the law, like during a divorce, you need to hold someone's hand. And as the person whose hand you're holding doesn't feel like they're on their team, that makes the divorce process much more difficult. So, thank you.
Danish, would you like to add anything?
No, I mean, obviously, we knew how impressive you were before this, but now the whole audience gets to see it as well.
Thank you. That's very good.
And and it's really, I'm really glad that people can see, like, lawyers are not monsters. Obviously, we have a perfectly capable one here as well. And it's not easy. It's a very complex. There's no definite answer to anything in this whole process. So I'm glad that hope people can see that it's just so complicated. And each case is different.
Yeah. I would definitely like for you to share with the audience how they can reach Ryan Legal and you specifically in regards to.
So I can give you my contact information.
I can definitely add in as with the caption. Yes. And thank you so much for demystifying this very, very difficult topic. And I am sure that everybody out there has learned something they were unaware of. And thank you for connecting with us. And
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure being here. I really appreciate that. Top 2 fold and hopefully you can split.
definitely, it was our